The moon hung low over Iron Bottom Sound on the night of December 11th, 1942, painting the dark Pacific waters in silver. 3 wooden boats idled in the shadow of Guadalcanal's coastline, their crews scanning the horizon with binoculars and raw nerves. Lieutenant Lester Gamble felt the tropical heat radiating off the engine covers behind him, heard the gentle lap of water against PT-37's plywood hull, smelled the mix of high-octane gasoline and salt water that defined life aboard these tiny warships. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Japanese destroyers were running the Tokyo Express, and Gamble's orders were simple: stop them. The Japanese Navy had every reason to dismiss these patrol torpedo boats as inconsequential pests. At 80 feet long and constructed of plywood over a wooden frame, PT boats looked more like rich men's pleasure craft than weapons of war. Japanese sailors called them devil boats, with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect. But the prevailing wisdom in the Imperial Navy was that these fragile speedboats posed no serious threat to steel warships displacing thousands of tons. That contempt would prove fatal. What those Japanese sailors didn't fully grasp was that beneath the deceptively civilian appearance, PT boats packed genuine lethality. 3 Packard Feist-12 engines, each delivering 1,500 horsepower, could push these vessels to 45 knots in calm seas. 4 torpedo tubes, twin 50 caliber machine gun turrets, and crews of young officers with something to prove transformed these wooden boats into genuine threats. But the real question mark, the factor that would determine whether PT boats lived up to their name or died trying, hung on a single piece of technology: the American torpedo. If you're interested in the untold stories of naval warfare and the men who fought in the shadows, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're diving deep into one of World War II's most misunderstood weapon systems, and what you're about to hear will change how you think about David versus Goliath battles at sea. The torpedo crisis. The United States entered World War II with a torpedo problem that bordered on catastrophic. While American propaganda celebrated technological superiority and industrial might, the reality at the sharp end of naval combat told a different story. The Mark 8 torpedo, standard issue for PT boats in 1942, traced its lineage back to World War I designs. 21 inches in diameter, carrying a 466-pound TNT warhead, the Mark 8 could theoretically reach 16,000 yards at 36 knots. Theoretically. In practice, PT boat crews watched in frustration as their torpedoes ran erratic courses, dove too deep, surfaced and broached in full view of enemy lookouts, or simply failed to detonate upon impact. The problems weren't limited to one weapon system. They plagued every torpedo in the American arsenal, from submarines to surface ships to aircraft. Depth control mechanisms failed. Magnetic exploders triggered prematurely or not at all. Contact exploders crushed without initiating the warhead. Months into the Pacific War, American torpedo reliability hovered somewhere around 30%. The reasons for this debacle ran deep into peacetime Navy culture. Live-fire testing had been severely limited before the war due to the expense of each weapon. Torpedoes cost as much as a new automobile. The Bureau of Ordnance had developed its weapons in theoretical isolation, resistant to feedback from fleet operators who actually used them in combat. When submarine commanders reported torpedo failures in 1942, Buord often blamed the reports on poor seamanship rather than investigating the weapons themselves. This institutional arrogance would cost American lives throughout the first 2 years of the Pacific War. PT boat crews faced additional challenges beyond the standard torpedo problems. The Mark 8 was heavy, over 3,000 pounds fully loaded, which affected the already marginal stability of these small boats. The weapons had to be fired from fixed tubes, requiring the entire boat to be aimed at the target like a gun. In calm waters against slow-moving targets, this worked adequately. Against alert, fast-moving Japanese destroyers equipped with searchlights and rapid-fire cannons, it became a deadly gamble. The Mark 13 torpedo told an even more troubling story. Originally designed in the 1930s as America's first purpose-built aerial torpedo, the Mark 13 had shown promise in pre-war testing. A lighter weapon at 2,216 pounds, carrying a 600-pound Torpex warhead with greater explosive power than TNT, the Mark 13 seemed like the future of airdropped anti-ship warfare. Then came actual combat. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the Mark 13's catastrophic failures contributed to the near-total loss of American torpedo bomber squadrons. 90% of the TBD devastators that attacked the Japanese carrier fleet were shot down, many before they could even release their torpedoes. The weapons themselves proved almost as dangerous to American aircrews as Japanese fighters. Dropped from the required low altitude and slow speed, the Mark 13 frequently broke apart on water impact, veered wildly off course, or armed itself prematurely, sometimes while still attached to the aircraft. Engineers at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, identified 12 major design flaws in the Mark 13. The tail fins broke off during water entry. The wooden nose shroud designed to cushion impact often failed, causing the warhead to detonate on contact with the water's surface. The gyroscope that controlled the torpedo's course couldn't handle the shock of a rough drop and would tumble, sending the weapon spinning in random circles. The depth control mechanism, already unreliable in the Mark 8, proved even less consistent in the lighter airborne weapon. By late 1942, the Bureau of Ordnance faced a crisis of confidence. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, personally intervened after receiving report after report of torpedo failures from every theater of the war. Buord had two choices: admit the Mark 13 was unfixable and start from scratch on a completely new torpedo design, or bring in outside expertise to solve problems that Navy engineers had failed to address. The Bureau chose both. The California Institute of Technology received an emergency contract through the National Defense Research Committee to fix the Mark 13. In parallel, development began on the Mark 25. A backup plan if Caltech's fixes failed. The institutional humiliation of admitting civilian scientists might solve problems that naval engineers couldn't was substantial. The alternative, continuing to send American aviators and PT boat crews into combat with weapons that failed 7 times out of 10, was unacceptable. Wooden boats, steel courage. While scientists and engineers struggled with torpedo problems thousands of miles away, PT boat crews in the South Pacific fought with what they had. The Guadalcanal campaign had become a grinding battle of attrition by late 1942. Japanese forces controlled the island by day, when American air superiority made large-scale naval operations suicidal. At night, the tables turned. Japanese destroyers raced down the Slot, New Georgia Sound, delivering supplies and reinforcements to isolated garrisons in what American forces dubbed the Tokyo Express. PT boat squadrons based at Tulagi represented one of the few American assets capable of operating in these narrow, island-studded waters at night. The boats' shallow draft allowed them to hug coastlines where larger warships couldn't follow. Their speed let them sprint in, launch torpedoes, and escape before Japanese gunners could find the range. In theory. In practice, every Tokyo Express interception was a calculated risk bordering on suicide. PT boats had no armor. A single hit from a destroyer's 5-inch gun could blow one apart. They carried enough high-octane aviation gasoline to run 3 powerful engines at combat speed, which meant any hit that penetrated the hull often resulted in catastrophic fire. The torpedoes themselves, temperamental and unreliable, gave crews perhaps a 30% chance of a hit even if everything else went perfectly. The crews themselves were young. Most officers were in their 20s, many enlisted men still teenagers. They volunteered for PT boat duty knowing the risks, drawn by the promise of independent command, aggressive action, and the chance to take the fight directly to the enemy. The Navy's peacetime regulations would never have assigned such responsibility to officers so young and inexperienced. War changed the calculations. Lieutenant Lester Gamble embodied this new breed of naval officer. Commissioned in 1941, he'd made his way to the South Pacific as part of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, arriving in time for the Guadalcanal campaign's darkest days. By December 1942, Gamble had already survived multiple engagements with Japanese destroyers, learning hard lessons about patience, timing, and the critical importance of surprise. He knew that PT boats couldn't stand and fight. They had to strike and vanish. On the afternoon of December 11th, intelligence reports filtered down to the PT boat base at Tulagi. Japanese destroyers were running the express again. Marine dive bombers had spotted and attacked the formation without significant success. As darkness fell, the responsibility shifted to Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. Gamble's PT-37 would lead a division of 3 boats, Stilly Taylor's PT-40 and Bill Kreiner's PT-48, to patrol positions off Guadalcanal's northwestern coast. 2 more boats, Frank Freeland's PT-44 and Charlie Tilden's PT-110, would cover Camimbo Bay to the north, an area of rough water the crews called the Bitch Patrol. What American intelligence didn't know was the identity of the Japanese flagship running that night's express. The destroyer Teruzuki had only completed construction in June 1942, one of the new Akizuki-class destroyers that represented the Imperial Navy's latest thinking on anti-aircraft warfare. 400 feet long, displacing 2,700 tons, Teruzuki mounted 8 rapid-fire 100mm dual-purpose guns in 4 twin turrets. Advanced fire control systems gave these weapons accuracy that older Japanese destroyers lacked. Teruzuki had already proven her worth in blood. During the naval battle of Guadalcanal on November 13th, her guns had helped sink the American destroyers USS Laffey and USS Monson, crippled USS Sterett, and contributed to the chaos that characterized that brutal night action. The following night, Teruzuki's torpedoes had been among those that struck the battleship USS South Dakota. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, one of Japan's most capable and aggressive destroyer commanders, had chosen Teruzuki as his flagship for the December 11th express run. Tanaka understood the risks better than most. He'd been running the Tokyo Express since August, losing ships to American aircraft, submarines, and surface forces. A failed run on December 5th, turned back by enemy planes and motor torpedo boats, had left Japanese Army forces on Guadalcanal increasingly desperate. Admiral Yamamoto himself had sent Tanaka a personal message emphasizing the critical importance of getting supplies through. This wasn't a mission Tanaka could decline or delay. The force Tanaka assembled reflected the mission's dual nature as both supply run and potential combat operation. 11 destroyers total, with 6 loaded down with supply drums lashed to their decks and 5 configured for combat. Teruzuki led the formation, her advanced fire control radar and experienced crew making her the ideal flagship. If American forces tried to interfere, Tanaka had the firepower to fight his way through. Contact PT-37's engines idled in near silence as Gamble and his crew waited in the shadows off Guadalcanal's coast. The moon provided just enough illumination to make out shapes at medium range, but not enough to rob the PT boats of their primary advantage: surprise. Hours passed with no contact. The tropical night pressed down, humid and oppressive, broken only by the sound of water against the hull and the occasional crackle of the radio. Gentle currents pushed the 3 PT boats farther apart as they drifted, maintaining radio silence to avoid alerting Japanese radio direction finders. By 1 o'clock in the morning, Gamble knew only the general positions of PT-40 and PT-48, somewhere in the darkness to his left and right. The waiting became its own form of stress, Every shadow might be an enemy destroyer, every distant sound potentially hostile engines. At 1:15 hours, shapes materialized from the southeast. Not one ship, but multiple contacts moving in line formation toward the entrance to the slot. Around Gamble, the crews of all 3 PT boats locked onto the approaching targets simultaneously. Then they noticed something unusual. One destroyer had separated from the main formation, steaming closer to the island, closer to the waiting PT boats. Gamble made his decision in seconds. Wait for the formation to close further, maximizing the chance of a hit, while minimizing the time under fire after launching torpedoes. The crews held their positions, watching the Japanese destroyers grow larger in the darkness. Every man knew that if Japanese lookouts spotted them now, before they could attack, the PT boats would be caught stationary, perfect targets for destroyer gunfire. The seconds stretched into minutes. Gamble watched the separated destroyer through his binoculars, calculating range and bearing. 500 yards. Close enough that a miss would be inexcusable, close enough that Japanese gunners would have an easy shot once the torpedoes were away. The roar of PT-37's engines shattered the night as Gamble slammed the throttles forward. The boat leaped onto plane, 3 Packard V-12s, driving her toward 35 knots in seconds. Around him, PT-40 and PT-48 surged forward simultaneously, converging on the Japanese formation. The element of surprise had been spent. Now it was a race between torpedo launch and enemy reaction. Gamble felt the compressed air blast as PT-37's torpedoes launched, heard the heavy splash as each Mark 8 hit the water. Without waiting to observe results, he threw the helm over, wheeling PT-37 around and laying smoke. Behind him, PT-40 and PT-48 followed suit, all 3 boats racing for the cover of Guadalcanal's coastline. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the night turned orange as thousands of pounds of water erupted skyward. The shock wave rolled across Iron Bottom Sound, a physical pressure against eardrums and chest cavities. They'd hit. The target was Tanaka's flagship, Teruzuki, one Mark 8 torpedo. One of the weapons that had proven so unreliable throughout 1942 had struck home near the destroyer's stern. The explosion destroyed Teruzuki's rudder and steering gear, opened the aft hull to flooding, and threw Admiral Tanaka unconscious to the deck. Burning fuel oil ignited, turning the crippled destroyer into a beacon visible for miles. Gamble and his crews didn't know they'd hit the flagship, didn't know they'd just effectively ended Raizo Tanaka's at-sea career. They knew only that one of the destroyers was dead in the water and burning, and that the rest of the Japanese formation would be coming for blood. The price of victory. To the north, Frank Freeland listened to his radio with growing excitement. PT-44 and PT-110 had been patrolling the rough waters off Camimbo Bay, away from the main action. Now Freeland heard the unmistakable sounds of Gamble's engagement. He made the aggressive choice, wheel south and join the fight. PT-44 arrived to find Teruzuki battling fires on her stern, other destroyers maneuvering to assist their crippled flagship. Freeland charged in, passing close to Teruzuki's burning stern in search of additional targets. Too close. Chuck Milhorn, one of PT-44's officers, pointed out what Freeland already knew. They'd illuminated themselves against the burning destroyer's light. A massive black shadow emerged from the darkness, the destroyer Arashi, moving to assist Teruzuki. Freeland lined up for a torpedo shot, but another call-out froze the order on his lips. 2 more destroyers had appeared, cutting off PT-44's escape route back to Guadalcanal. In the chaos, PT-110 had managed to slip away into the darkness. Freeland was alone. The destroyers Kawakaze and Suzukaze had spotted the PT boat illuminated against Teruzuki's fires. Their 5-inch guns opened up, throwing shells that churned the sea around PT-44 into geysers of white water. Freeland threw his boat into evasive maneuvers, laying smoke and running for the dark coastline of Savo Island. Walls of water erupted around PT-44 as Japanese gunners walked their fire closer. South of Savo Island, the shell splashes seemed to decrease. Freeland made another aggressive decision: wheel around and try for a torpedo shot. PT-44 launched back into the darkness, but this time Japanese optics and fire control had the range. A 5-inch shell punched through PT-44's engine room. More shells followed, blasting the wooden boat into burning fragments. Men dove over the side as the hull disintegrated beneath them. Chuck Melhorn surfaced, gasping for air. Frank Freeland did not. Of PT-44's entire crew, only 2 men would survive. Aboard the burning Teruzuki, the situation deteriorated beyond salvage. Fires reached the aft powder magazines for the destroyer's 100 mm guns. The resulting explosion broke the ship's back. Captain Tsuneo Orita ordered the Kingston valves opened, scuttling Teruzuki before she could capsize and trap men below. By 0440 hours, the destroyer slipped beneath the waves. Destroyers Arashi and Naganami rescued 196 survivors from the water. Another 156 men were forced to swim for Kamimbo, struggling through dark waters filled with fuel oil and debris. As the sun rose over Iron Bottom Sound, the only evidence of the night's violence was wreckage floating on gentle swells and exhausted Japanese sailors still swimming for shore. The Tokyo Express had been turned back again. Gamble and his surviving crews had achieved what many thought impossible. 3 wooden boats armed with unreliable torpedoes had sunk the largest warship ever destroyed by PT boats in World War II. The cost was 1 PT boat destroyed and Frank Freeland's crew killed or missing. For the Imperial Navy, the loss of Teruzuki forced Admiral Tanaka's reassignment to Burma, the Navy's way of removing a talented commander from a post where aggressive action had resulted in unacceptable losses. Within months, Japanese High Command would begin Operation K, the evacuation of Guadalcanal. The campaign was effectively over. The Revolution. While PT boat crews celebrated victories like Teruzuki with whatever alcohol they could scrounge in the South Pacific, scientists at the California Institute of Technology were revolutionizing torpedo technology. The problems with the Mark 13 that had killed so many torpedo bomber crews at Midway demanded solutions that went beyond incremental improvements. Caltech's approach differed fundamentally from the Naval Torpedo Station's traditional methods. Rather than trying to fix individual problems in isolation, the civilian scientists examined the Mark 13's water entry dynamics as an integrated system. High-speed photography revealed exactly how the torpedo behaved during those critical first seconds after leaving an aircraft. The tail fins broke off because they were absorbing forces they'd never been designed to handle. The nose shroud failed because wood couldn't consistently cushion the impact energies involved. The gyroscope tumbled because the entire torpedo was subjected to rotational forces during water entry that exceeded the gyro's stabilization limits. The solutions Caltech developed were elegant in their simplicity. A low-drag shroud ring reinforced the tail fins, preventing them from breaking off during water entry. A pickle barrel drag ring fitted around the torpedo's midsection acted as both shock absorber and stabilizer, slowing the weapon during the critical first moments after drop. This allowed the torpedo to maintain proper alignment as it entered the water, preventing the gyroscope from tumbling. A water trip valve delayed firing the igniter until the torpedo was fully submerged, eliminating premature detonations. The modifications collectively transformed the Mark 13 from one of the war's worst torpedoes into one of its best. Original specifications required dropping the Mark 13 from altitudes below 50 feet at speeds under 110 knots. The improved versions could be dropped from 2,400 feet at speeds up to 410 knots. This meant aircraft could attack from altitudes that gave them a fighting chance against anti-aircraft fire at speeds that made them harder targets. The Bureau of Ordnance, swallowing its pride, rushed the modifications into production. To accelerate deployment, Boulard manufactured replacement tail assemblies with the shroud rings pre-attached and sent them directly to fleet units as retrofit kits. By fall 1944, the new Mark 13 modifications had wide distribution throughout the Pacific Fleet. The timing proved critical. In October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf would become the largest naval engagement in history. TBF and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, armed with the improved Mark 13, helped sink Japanese super battleships Yamato and Musashi. The weapons that had failed so catastrophically at Midway finally worked as designed. For PT boats, the Mark 13 offered advantages beyond improved reliability. The weapon was lighter than the Mark 8, 2,216 pounds versus over 3,000. This weight savings allowed PT boats to carry more torpedoes or replace some torpedo capacity with additional gun armament. More significantly, the Mark 13 used a different launch system. Instead of fixed tubes that required aiming the entire boat at the target, the Mark 13 was launched from Mark 1 torpedo launching racks that simply rolled the weapon off the side of the boat. This gave PT boat commanders far more tactical flexibility. A boat could approach a target from an angle, launch torpedoes, and begin evasive maneuvers almost simultaneously rather than having to hold course until the torpedoes cleared the tubes. The shift to Mark 13 torpedoes began in late 1943 as production ramped up and retrofit kits became available. PT boat squadrons received both the improved torpedoes and SO radar sets that allowed target detection at ranges up to 15 miles. These improvements transformed the boats from weapons that relied almost entirely on surprise and aggression into platforms capable of more sophisticated tactics. Evolution in combat. The improved Mark 13 arrived in time for some of the Pacific War's most intensive PT boat operations. As American forces advanced northward through the Solomon Islands and into the Philippines, PT boat squadrons found themselves operating in increasingly complex environments. The days of simple interceptions against Tokyo Express runs gave way to coordinated attacks on Japanese convoys, night harassment of enemy bases, and support for amphibious landings. The Mark 13's reliability meant PT boat commanders could plan attacks with confidence that their weapons would function. No longer did crews watch in frustration as torpedoes broached, ran in circles, or failed to detonate. The improved weapons ran hot, straight, and normal, the way torpedoes were supposed to behave. This psychological shift was as important as the technical improvements. On July 20, 1943, 3 PT boats armed with Mark 13 torpedoes ambushed a Japanese convoy off Vella La Vella. The boats successfully sank 2 transport ships carrying 6,000 enemy soldiers destined to reinforce Kolombangara. The attack demonstrated what PT boats could achieve when their weapons actually worked. Instead of relying on lucky hits from unreliable torpedoes, commanders could execute tactical plans that assumed their weapons would perform as designed. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was substantial. Early in the war, Japanese destroyer commanders had learned to treat PT boat attacks with caution, but not genuine fear. The boats were dangerous if they achieved surprise, but their weapons were unreliable enough that aggressive counteraction often drove them off before they could score hits. The improved Mark 13 changed that calculation. Now, if PT boats achieved firing position, hits became probable rather than possible. Japanese naval doctrine adapted to the increased threat. Destroyers on supply runs began assigning specific vessels as anti-PT boat escorts, equipped with searchlights and trained to counter the small boat's tactics. Some Japanese destroyers began carrying additional light anti-aircraft weapons specifically configured for surface action against PT boats. The fact that the Imperial Navy devoted resources to countering PT boats validated the effectiveness of the American weapons. PT boat tactics evolved in response to Japanese countermeasures. Rather than attacking singly or in pairs, Boats began coordinating larger group attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Some boats would illuminate targets with star shells or draw fire, while others maneuvered for torpedo shots. The improved radar allowed one boat to direct others to targets that remained invisible in the darkness. These tactics required reliable torpedoes. Wasting a coordinated approach on weapons that wouldn't function defeated the entire purpose. The Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944 demonstrated both the potential and limitations of PT boats in major surface actions. 39 PT boats formed the initial defense line as Japanese battleships and destroyers attempted to force their way through Surigao Strait toward the American invasion fleet at Leyte. The PT boats attacked throughout the night, launching torpedoes and harassing the Japanese formation. The results were mixed. PT boats scored no confirmed hits on major Japanese warships at Surigao Strait. However, their attacks disrupted the Japanese formation, slowed the enemy advance, and provided critical intelligence about the composition and location of Japanese forces. American destroyers and battleships waiting farther up the strait benefited from this information when they engaged and destroyed the Japanese force. The Surigao Strait action illustrated an important reality about PT boat effectiveness. Against alert, heavily armed warships in open water, the small boats faced severe limitations. Their light wooden hulls made them vulnerable to even a single hit from destroyer-caliber weapons. Their low profiles made accurate torpedo firing difficult in any kind of sea state. The Mark 13 was a better weapon than the Mark 8, but no torpedo could compensate for tactical situations that favored the target. Where PT boats excelled was in the role they'd proven effective from the beginning: interdiction of small craft and harassment in confined waters. Japanese supply operations in the Philippines relied heavily on coastal barges and small transports that moved between islands under cover of darkness. Against these targets, PT boats armed with improved Mark 13 torpedoes and enhanced gun armament proved devastatingly effective. The boats became hunters in the island channels and coastal waters where larger American warships couldn't operate effectively. A single PT boat could wreak havoc on a barge convoy, sinking loaded transports and leaving Japanese ground forces without ammunition, food, or reinforcements. Multiple PT boats working together could interdict entire supply routes, forcing the Japanese to either abandon operations or commit destroyer escorts they could ill afford to lose. By 1944, many PT boats had been reconfigured as gunboats rather than pure torpedo platforms. Additional 50-caliber machine guns, 20mm and 40mm automatic cannons, and even rocket launchers turned PT boats into floating arsenals, optimized for close-range combat against lightly armored targets. Some boats retained Mark 13 torpedoes for targets of opportunity, but the primary armament became guns. This evolution reflected practical reality. The majority of PT boats in service from 1942 to 1945 each fired fewer than 2 torpedoes in combat. Opportunities to launch torpedoes at suitable targets were relatively rare, while opportunities to engage barges, landing craft, and coastal installations with gunfire were abundant. The Mark 13 gave PT boats a reliable torpedo option when they needed it, but guns proved more versatile for the missions these boats actually performed. The human element. The technical evolution of torpedoes from the unreliable Mark 8 and early Mark 13 to the improved later models tells only part of the story. The men who crewed these boats fought throughout the transition period, enduring the frustration of weapon failures while maintaining the aggressive spirit that made PT boat operations effective. Consider the psychological impact of going into combat knowing your primary weapon had a 70% failure rate. PT boat crews in 1942 and early 1943 faced exactly that situation. They understood that even if they executed a perfect attack approach, achieved surprise, and put themselves in ideal firing position, their torpedoes would probably miss or malfunction. Despite this knowledge, they kept attacking. The young officers who commanded PT boats came from diverse backgrounds. Some were Naval Academy graduates who'd requested PT boat assignment seeking independent command and combat action. Others came through reserve officer programs, civilians who'd learned seamanship on pleasure craft and found themselves commanding warships. What united them was a willingness to take calculated risks that more conservative officers would refuse. Lieutenant Richard Hamilton's story illustrates the type. Before the war, Hamilton worked as an agricultural statistician, about as far from naval combat as one could imagine. Within 2 years of entering military service, he was a decorated PT boat captain with multiple combat actions to his credit. The Navy had no mechanism for identifying and training such men in peacetime. War created the necessity, and young men stepped forward to fill roles they'd never imagined occupying. The enlisted crews came from equally diverse backgrounds. Motor machinists' mates had to keep 3 temperamental high-performance engines running in tropical heat and salt spray, often making field repairs under combat conditions. Torpedo men maintained weapon systems that were unreliable by design, trying to coax performance from torpedoes that frequently failed despite perfect maintenance. Gunners manned 50-caliber machine guns, knowing their light weapons gave them virtually no defense against destroyer cannon. The casualty rates reflected the danger. PT boats were lost to enemy gunfire, aerial attack, accidents, and weather throughout the Pacific Campaign. When a wooden boat filled with high-octane gasoline took a direct hit, survivors were the exception rather than the rule. Men went into the water at night, often far from friendly shores, sometimes in waters where sharks were a genuine threat. Rescue was never guaranteed. The improvement in torpedo reliability directly affected survival rates. When torpedoes worked as designed, PT boats could attack from greater range and disengage more quickly. The old Mark 8 tubes required holding course until the torpedoes cleared, precious seconds when Japanese gunners could find the range. The Mark 13's roll-off racks allowed simultaneous launch and evasion. Those seconds of difference could mean the difference between escape and destruction. Crew morale improved as weapons became more reliable. Going into combat with confidence in your equipment changes the psychological dynamic entirely. Early war PT boat crews fought with a kind of fatalistic aggression born of knowing their torpedoes probably wouldn't work. Later war crews attacked with the confidence that came from weapons that functioned. That confidence translated into more effective tactics and better combat outcomes. The base facilities where PT boat crews lived between missions offered minimal comfort. Tulagi, one of the primary PT boat bases during the Guadalcanal campaign, consisted of tents, improvised workshops, and a fuel depot. Men slept on cots, ate from mess facilities that would charitably be described as basic, and dealt with tropical diseases, insects, and the constant threat of Japanese air raids. Between combat missions, there was maintenance, more maintenance, and the occasional rest period that rarely felt restful. The bonds formed under these conditions ran deep. PT boat crews were small, typically 12 to 14 men per boat. They lived together, fought together, and sometimes died together. The loss of a boat meant losing friends, not just casualties on a report. Frank Freeland's death aboard PT-44 wasn't a statistic to the men who'd served with him. It was a personal loss that reminded every survivor how thin the margin between life and death could be. Legacy and reality. The popular image of PT boats owes much to post-war mythologizing. John F. PT boats proved highly effective in their primary role, interdicting small craft and supply operations in coastal waters where larger warships couldn't effectively operate. They were less effective in direct combat against major warships, though not entirely ineffective, as the Teruzuki sinking demonstrated. They served valuable secondary roles as scouts, rescue platforms for downed air crews, and rapid response forces. The torpedo question remained central to assessments of PT boat effectiveness. The 464 PT boats in U.S. Navy service during World War II fired approximately 700 torpedoes total. This seemingly low number reflected several factors. Many boats converted to gunboat configuration. Opportunities for torpedo attacks were less frequent than initially expected, and early torpedo unreliability discouraged commanders from wasting weapons on low-probability shots. When torpedoes did work, the results validated the entire PT boat concept. The Teruzuki sinking, achieved with older Mark 8 torpedoes, demonstrated that even unreliable weapons could succeed with proper tactics and a measure of luck. Later actions with improved Mark 13 torpedoes showed what PT boats could achieve when their weapons functioned as designed. The Japanese Navy's response to PT boats provides perhaps the most objective measure of their effectiveness. If PT boats were truly negligible threats, the Imperial Navy wouldn't have devoted resources to countering them. The fact that Japanese destroyers began carrying additional anti-PT boat armament, that supply operations adjusted schedules to minimize exposure to PT boat attacks, and that Japanese sailors developed genuine respect for the Devil boats, all indicate that these small vessels had meaningful impact. The technological evolution from unreliable early war torpedoes to the improved Mark 13 paralleled America's broader industrial and scientific mobilization. The willingness to bring in civilian scientists when military engineers failed demonstrated a pragmatism that contrasted sharply with the pre-war Bureau of Ordnance's institutional arrogance. Caltech's success in fixing the Mark 13 validated an approach that would be repeated throughout the war. Identify problems, bring in experts regardless of institutional boundaries, and accept solutions that worked even if they challenged existing practices. For the men who served aboard PT boats, the improved torpedoes meant more than enhanced combat effectiveness. They represented validation that their experiences and reports mattered, that the Navy was listening to feedback from the fleet and acting on it. The contrast between attacking with weapons known to be unreliable and attacking with confidence in your equipment affected every aspect of combat operations from tactics to morale. The broader context PT boat operations in the Pacific formed one small component of the massive naval war between the United States and Japan. While these boats fought their small unit actions in island channels and coastal waters, aircraft carriers dueled across vast oceanic distances, battleships pounded shore installations, and submarines strangled Japan's merchant marine. Yet the PT boats' contributions mattered precisely because they could operate in environments and situations where larger, more powerful vessels could not. The Tokyo Express runs that PT boats helped interdict represented Japan's desperate attempts to sustain isolated garrisons as American forces advanced. Every supply run that PT boats turned back, every barge convoy they destroyed, every destroyer they damaged or sank accelerated the strangulation of Japanese forces. This was attrition warfare at its most fundamental, denying the enemy the supplies, reinforcements, and equipment needed to continue fighting. The Guadalcanal campaign, where PT boats like Gamble's PT-37 fought the Teruzuki, marked the turning point in the Pacific War. Before Guadalcanal, Japan maintained the strategic initiative, advancing across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. After Guadalcanal, the initiative passed permanently to American forces. PT boats' contribution to that outcome was real if modest. They helped deny Japan the ability to sustain its forces on the island. The torpedo crisis that plagued PT boats in 1942 and early 1943 reflected deeper problems in American pre-war military culture. Inadequate testing, resistance to feedback from fleet operators, and institutional arrogance had created a situation where American forces entered World War II with torpedoes that failed at catastrophic rates. The fix required admitting failure, accepting outside help, and fundamentally changing how the Navy developed and tested weapons. That these changes occurred during wartime, under the pressure of combat losses and urgent operational requirements, demonstrated both the flexibility and the dysfunction of American military institutions. The flexibility showed in the willingness to bring in Caltech scientists and give them authority to redesign critical weapons systems. The dysfunction showed in the fact that such desperate measures were necessary because peacetime institutions had failed so completely. The human cost of these institutional failures deserves acknowledgement. The torpedo bomber crews who died at Midway, attacking with weapons that had a 90% failure rate, paid the price for pre-war testing inadequacies. PT boat crews who watched their torpedoes malfunction while under fire from Japanese destroyers faced death because the Bureau of Ordnance had prioritized cost savings over adequate live-fire testing. Frank Freeland and the crews of dozens of other PT boats lost in combat might have survived if their torpedoes had worked reliably from the war's beginning. Yet dwelling solely on failures and costs misses the larger story of adaptation and improvement. The Mark 13 that entered service in 1944 was a genuinely excellent torpedo, capable of performance that exceeded original design specifications. American industry produced these weapons in quantities that overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. By war's end, the torpedo that had been one of America's worst weapons had become one of its best. Conclusion. On a dark night in December 1942, 3 wooden boats attacked a Japanese destroyer force in Iron Bottom Sound. They launched torpedoes that had proven unreliable throughout the year's fighting, weapons that failed more often than they worked. Against the odds, those torpedoes found their mark, sinking the destroyer Teruzuki and temporarily halting the Tokyo Express. That engagement encapsulated both the promise and the frustration of PT boat operations in World War II. When everything worked, tactics, timing, weapons, and luck, these small boats could achieve results far beyond what their size suggested possible. When weapons failed, when Japanese lookouts spotted the attack before torpedoes launched, when a single destroyer shell found its mark, PT boats died. The evolution from unreliable Mark 8 and early Mark 13 torpedoes to the improved later models paralleled America's broader learning curve in the Pacific War. Early defeats and frustrations gave way to technical improvements, tactical innovations, and the industrial capacity to build weapons in quantities that made individual failures less critical. By 1944, PT boats armed with improved Mark 13 torpedoes and enhanced radar could execute attacks that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. The Japanese sailors who initially dismissed PT boats as negligible threats learned otherwise. The Devil boats that struck from darkness and vanished before Japanese gunners could respond proved dangerous enough to require dedicated countermeasures. Whether armed with the older Mark 8 or the improved Mark 13, PT boats commanded respect through aggressive action and willingness to engage forces far more powerful. The men who crewed these boats deserve recognition, not for mythological heroism, but for the harder reality of going into combat with inadequate weapons and making them work anyway. They fought through the frustration of torpedo failures, adapted tactics to compensate for weapon deficiencies, and kept attacking even when the odds were against them. When better weapons became available, they used those improved tools to increase their effectiveness. Lester Gamble's attack on the Teruzuki represents PT boat operations at their best. Careful patience, giving way to aggressive action, surprise leveraged to maximum effect, and torpedoes that worked when it mattered most. That one of those torpedoes was a Mark 8, the older, less reliable weapon, makes the achievement more rather than less impressive. The improved Mark 13 that came later gave PT boat crews better tools, but the courage and skill required remained constant. The legacy of PT boats extends beyond their direct combat achievements. They demonstrated that small, relatively inexpensive platforms could contribute meaningfully to naval warfare if employed in roles that matched their capabilities. They proved the value of aggressive leadership and decentralized command in fluid combat situations. They showed that weapon reliability matters as much as raw capability, a lesson learned in blood by crews who fought with failing torpedoes. Above all, the PT boat story reminds us that wars are fought not by ships and weapons, but by people. The young officers who commanded these boats, the enlisted men who kept engines running and guns firing, the casualties who paid the ultimate price, they turned potentially ineffective weapons into tools that contributed to victory. Their story deserves to be remembered not as mythology, but as the complex reality of courage, frustration, adaptation, and ultimately success. When Japanese sailors initially laughed at the PT boats approaching their formations, they weren't entirely wrong to be skeptical. Wooden boats armed with unreliable torpedoes didn't seem like serious threats to steel destroyers. But those sailors learned, some in the last moments before their ships went down, that courage and aggression can compensate for technical disadvantages. And when American torpedoes finally worked as designed, the laughter stopped permanently. Kennedy's command of PT-109 and the subsequent publicity around his war service created a romantic vision of these vessels that didn't always match the complex reality. PT boats were neither the unstoppable weapons of propaganda nor the useless boats that historian Samuel Eliot Morison labeled them in his frustration with exaggerated claims. The reality was more nuanced.